Hey, let's retouch this image with me. For new people here, I'm Kateryna, but you can call me Kat. I'm a high-end retoucher, and today I'll show you how I retouched, color graded, and composited a completely new background for this image to turn it into this dark cinematic siren goddess kind of scene. Okay, so let's start with the plan. First, I definitely need to clean up all these stray hairs and make the wig feel a little more polished. Then I'll probably soften and fix some of the folds on the corset so they don't pull too much attention. I also really want the shoes to match the hair better, so later I'm gonna recolor them red to tie everything together a bit more. And of course, the most important part today is the whole concept and atmosphere. Right now, while I'm recording this part, I actually still haven't generated the background yet, but I already know I want this to feel like some kind of dark, stormy ocean scene with water underneath her and this whole cinematic siren goddess energy. I feel like this model fits that concept so well, honestly. And I also don't want the image to feel too dark or heavy, so I think later I'll probably add some softer elements too, maybe flowers or floating petals or something like that, just to bring a little more balance into the scene. First step, I'm starting with the skin cleanup. I'm using the spot healing brush tool to remove some small imperfections and slightly even out the skin texture, especially around the neck and chin area. I'm not overdoing it here though, because the image is already pretty clean. Most of my attention here is actually going toward the folds on the neck. I just want to soften them a little bit so they don't stand out quite as much and pull unnecessary attention. For the neck cleanup, I'm mixing generative fill and the remove tool together to find pieces and texture that fit nicely. And then I'm masking everything back manually and keeping only the parts I actually like. I'm also doing a tiny bit of cleanup on the chest area, shoulder, and arm. Mostly just a few small pigment spots and little distractions. Now it's time for the wig cleanup. I'm using the spot healing brush tool here too, and I'm mainly removing all the little stray hairs inside the hairstyle that are catching too much attention. The important thing here is not to overdo it. I'm not removing every single hair that's laying weirdly. I mostly focus on the ones that cross over other strands, stick out in random directions, or catch too much light and suddenly become super bright compared to everything else. I am also slightly cleaning up parts of the contour where needed. And this area behind her back that you can see right now is honestly super messy. I'll fix that a little later though and show you a better way to rebuild and repaint those sections using the brush tool. And now it's time for the outer contour cleanup. Since I already know I'll be compositing a completely new background later, I'm not trying to preserve every tiny natural hair here. What matters more to me is keeping the overall shape and silhouette of the hairstyle readable and believable. So honestly, I'm just aggressively painting over the whole contour with the clone stamp tool. The main thing here is making sure you don't create obvious repeating stamp patterns or weird texture patches. After that, I invert the mask and start drawing parts of the background manually with a white brush on the black mask. And here I'm constantly zooming in and out to check how the silhouette actually reads from a distance. Like for example here, I zoomed out a few times and realized this extra little hair section was pulling too much attention and making the silhouette feel messy, so I removed it completely. And now we're back again to this area behind her back. This is honestly a really difficult section. If this was just a normal fashion retouch without compositing, I would probably mask this area using channels and curves instead. But here I don't really want to overcomplicate things, because I only need a few strands to survive and guide the future repaint. So right now, I'm just manually correcting everything with masks and cleanup layers to create a cleaner base silhouette that I can later use as guidance when I repaint the hair on top. And of course, I'm quickly fixing a few other little areas around her face. Okay, now it's time to work on the outfit. I'm using the remove tool first to clean up a few folds on the pants. Luckily, the material here is very smooth and seamless, so I don't really have to worry too much about preserving texture. I can just quickly remove some of the more distracting folds. The corset area is a little trickier though, because the fabric actually has texture and pattern built into it. But thankfully, it's not some super strict repeating pattern, so I can still clean things up pretty quickly without it becoming too obvious. I'm not removing too much with the remove tool though, because my main goal right now is really just creating a cleaner base before the actual outfit cleanup. I just want less work for myself later. Now I'm setting up frequency separation layers. You can see the settings I'm using on the screen. And then, with the mixer brush, I'm softly blending and brightening out parts of the corset, especially the darker shadow patches that feel a little too harsh. I'm also going over some areas on the pants to soften the folds a bit more. I'm not touching the top texture layer itself. I mostly work underneath it, so I can preserve the fabric detail while still smoothing the lighting transitions. And after that, I simply lower the opacity of the cleanup layer a little bit so the corrections don't feel too obvious or overdone. And honestly, for the result I wanted here, that was already more than enough. And now let's recolor the shoe. For this, I'm using a combination of solid color fill layers and curves adjustment layers in different blend modes to build the exact tone that I want, instead of just throwing one color on top and calling it a day. I wanted the red to feel rich and cinematic, but still believable inside the lighting of the scene and connected to the wig color without becoming too bright or distracting. Once I found a color combination I liked, I quickly refined the shoe mask and made sure the red stays only where I actually need it and doesn't spill outside the edges of the shoe. I also noticed that this pocket on the pants was sticking out quite a lot, but at the same time I still want to keep it there, because little details like this actually help the outfit feel more realistic and natural. So here I'm using the Liquify tool to slightly fix the silhouette of the pants and top, and at the same time I'm adding a little more volume to the hair and pushing some of the waves on the wig a bit more. These are not huge changes at all, but they help the overall silhouette of the model feel cleaner and easier to read visually. And honestly, this is also the stage where it's really important not to overdo things. I'm not changing her facial features or reshaping her body or anything like that. Especially when you're retouching real people, I think it's important to stay respectful to the person while still polishing the image and following the creative direction. Hey, quick little mid-video break. If you want to study this edit and explore my workflow yourself, this exact layered PSD file is available in my shop. I also have a bunch of other PSDs there. Link is in the video description. And now, let's get back to retouching. And now it's time for dodge and burn. I actually dodging and burning this image in two different ways, locally and globally. Let's start with the local one first. Local dodge and burn basically means I'm working with a very small brush on low opacity and slowly going over little uneven areas on the skin. Here I'm softening some patches, smoothing the folds on the neck a little bit, slightly reducing the shadows in the underarm area so they're not as prominent, and overall just balancing some of the light and shadow transitions so the skin feels smoother and cleaner. And after that comes the global dodge and burn, which is honestly the most important one for me in this edit. This is the step that really helps me add more volume to the model and enhance the lighting that already exists on her. And this is especially important for compositing because the new background is going to be much more dramatic and expressive, so I need her to stand out against it while still feeling believable inside the scene. And yes, I know this looks a little crazy right now because I'm painting on 100% layer opacity, but I actually do this on purpose so I can clearly see where I'm building volume and shaping the light. After I finish sculpting the main forms, adding a bit more shine to the hair, enhancing some highlights on the jewelry and details like that, I just lower the opacity of the whole group. Usually I keep it around 10%, but for this image I actually wanted a slightly stronger effect, so I pushed it closer to 20%. Normally, if you go much stronger than that, it can start looking unnatural really fast, unless you're going for something super stylized on purpose. And now the really fun part starts, compositing. I generated the background using AI tools off screen, so I'm just dropping the final result in here right away. But by the way, let me know if you'd actually be interested in a separate video about prompting and generating backgrounds like this, because I can totally make one later. But for now, let's get back to the image itself. So first, I'm starting with cutting out the model and building the mask. I select her through select subject first, then go into select and mask and start adjusting the settings to grab as many small hairs as possible so I have less manual work later. And the little hair refinement tool on the left side helps so much for this. You can actually see me brushing over the hair right now to help Photoshop understand the edges better. My first pass still left a little bit of a white halo though, so I selected the same mask again, went back into select and mask one more time, and pushed shift edge to around -40% to pull the mask inward a little bit and remove that bright outline without having to manually fix everything later. And honestly, the second pass already looked so much cleaner. So now I'm just manually refining little areas on the mask with a black and white brush wherever something still feels too messy or soft around the contour. And once again, I'm paying extra attention to the hair behind her back because it was barely selected at all. So I need to manually rebuild at least some basic shape there that I can later use as guidance for repainting the hair. And by the way, don't worry about the flowers at the bottom for now. At this stage, I'm only focused on getting a clean silhouette around the model first. And now, as I promised earlier, I'll show you how I repaint the hair behind her back. Right now, it looks like this. I basically only have the rough shape and placement of the curls left, but all these leftover pieces of the old gray background now turn into super obvious bright patches against the new dark storm background, which looks really unnatural. So first, using the clone stamp tool on a new layer in darken mode, I start darkening all those lighter leftover areas with nearby pieces sampled directly from the wig itself. This doesn't have to look super clean or super realistic yet. yet. The main goal right now is honestly just removing those bright background pieces and making the individual curl shapes more visible so I can comfortably paint on top of them later. And now we finally move to the actual hair repainting part. Over the last 10 years of retouching, which honestly sounds terrifying to say out loud, I've built up a pretty decent little brush collection, so I'm just choosing one of my hair brushes and sampling nearby colors directly from the existing curls with the eyedropper tool. Then I start painting directly over the curls and slowly rebuilding volume strand by strand. At first, I'm honestly not even worrying too much about perfection. I'm mostly focused on building thickness and making the hair feel fuller, so it doesn't look like there are just a few random thin strips left. And it's really important here to work with different tones. Darker strands, highlighted strands, shadow areas, brighter areas. Because the more variation you add into the light and shadow, the more realistic the hair starts feeling. You can also see that the bottom of the wig gets pretty thin, so there are a lot of little gaps and transparent sections near the ends. I don't really want the storm background showing through those holes, so I'm also filling those areas in and building a heavier, fuller shape near the bottom. And honestly, for this whole repaint, I'm mostly using just one brush. Usually, 1 or 2 good hair brushes are already more than enough. I think it turned out really realistic, and most importantly, now the hair actually feels connected to the new background, instead of looking cut out and pasted in. Okay guys, now this next step is actually pretty straightforward. I'm basically just manually bringing back every single flower around the bottom part of the model through the mask. These are the flowers floating on top of the water, so it's really important for me not to leave random pieces of the dark water or stormy background showing through between the petals, because otherwise it starts looking really fake, really fast. But at the same time, since I already know I'll be adding shadows and depth in the next step, I'm also trying to keep the mask as clean as possible here. Otherwise, all the next adjustments can very quickly start creating muddy edges and weird, dirty looking areas. And right away after this, I move into adding shadows and small highlights. So first, using the lasso tool, I roughly select areas behind the flowers and add a little bit of shadow with curves to create more depth and push the flowers visually into the foreground so they actually feel like they're sitting in front of the model instead of just being pasted on top of her. And when I say highlights, what I mean is these small reflected light areas from the water. So again, very roughly with the lasso tool, I select these thin areas along the bottom of the pants near the water and also parts of the gloves. And with another curves adjustment layer, I add a soft bright reflection as if the water underneath is bouncing light back onto the fabric. And now I'm moving straight into the color grading. This time, the color correction is actually pretty simple and I'm doing most of it literally in just a few clicks. As my base, I'm using the built-in Photoshop loot called Foggy Night. It gives this really soft, even blue toning across the whole image, and as you can see, it also lifts the black point a little bit, which makes the image feel less harsh and contrasty. I'm only using it at a pretty low opacity though, around 15%, mostly just to tone the model a little bit more toward the environment so she starts fitting the background better. Then I'm adding another built-in loot called Drop Blues, and as you can see, it immediately kills a lot of the blue tones, but I'm actually using it mostly for the lighting effect it creates on the model, rather than for the colors themselves. So, I switch it into luminosity blend mode and lower the opacity again. And now you can see how the lighting on the model starts matching the clouds and atmosphere behind her much better. And the third loot is Film Stock 50. This one adds more contrast and warmth back into the image, because I don't want the model to completely blend into the background. She still needs to stay the focal point and attract attention, so she should be slightly warmer than the environment around her. And after that, I actually use Foggy Night one more time, but now only selectively on parts of the model through a mask. And this is where I want to quickly mention something really important. When you work with color grading, especially on portraits, it's very important not to push the toning too far. Yes, the model needs to fit the atmosphere of the image, but at the same time, you also need to stay respectful to the original skin tone and not completely alter it into something unnatural or problematic. Of course, there's always room for stylization and artistic processing, but from my personal experience, either follow the brief very carefully or constantly compare your before and after while grading, so you don't accidentally push things too far. Now it's time for adjusting global lighting. And honestly, this part is actually pretty simple too. First, I'm using one of my favorite loots for contrast work called Late Sunset. And yes, straight out of the box, it looks super purple and honestly kind of crazy, but it works so well with shadows and highlights. So again, I switch it into luminosity mode, and look what happens to the image now. The whites immediately become brighter and punchier, the darks become richer and moodier, and the whole image suddenly feels much more cinematic and attention-grabbing. But again, the skin tone shifts way too much if I leave it at full strength, so I lower the opacity to around 30% to keep the overall effect while avoiding making the toning too aggressive. And now I start pushing the attention toward the model even more. First, I use a few gradients to create something like a rough lighting sketch and map out where I want my light accents to be. Then, from this draft, I create a selection and use it as a mask for the curves adjustment layer, because this gives me a much more flexible and non-destructive workflow. That way, I can always come back later and change the curve itself, reduce the opacity, repaint the mask, or even completely adjust the effect whenever I want. That's honestly one of the best parts of working non-destructively. And if you look at the curves layer, I'm placing 3 points on the curve, so I'm not only brightening the model slightly, but also controlling the contrast and separation inside the highlights themselves. And finally, the last part of the global lighting is pretty straightforward. I take the gradient tool again and darken the edges of the image to create this almost spotlight-like effect that naturally pushes attention toward the center of the frame. But to make it feel less boring and static, I'm doing it at a slight diagonal angle instead of perfectly straight, probably somewhere around 45 degrees. And then I switch it into soft light mode and lower the opacity again so the effect stays subtle and cinematic instead of looking too obvious. Okay, now the model and the background already match much better color-wise, but they still feel like they exist in two completely different dimensions. And that's because, besides the flowers in the foreground, the model still doesn't really interact with the environment itself yet. So what's missing here is reflection. I quickly create a rough draft of where I want the reflection to be, lower the opacity a little bit, and crop this area. And I save this cropped section in two versions, one with the reflection draft and one without it, just to make prompting easier. And now I'm just dropping in the generated reflection result. As you can see, it came out a little too contrasty and saturated, but honestly, that's not a big problem. I quickly create a mask and start painting the reflection only where I actually need it. And I'm also adjusting the opacity with the brush so everything feels softer and more natural. The main thing here is that I want the texture of the water to stay more dominant than the reflection itself. Otherwise, it starts looking too clean and fake really quickly. And one important thing, I temporarily turned off the global lighting and color grading layers while working on the reflection area. It's just much easier for me to properly see the tones and blend everything without all the extra effects on top. So now I'm turning all those layers back on again. And of course, since I want this edit to feel as moody and cinematic as possible, there was absolutely no way I was going to stop without overlays. So first, I'm adding this old scratched film texture overlay, and then another paper texture on top of it. I lower the opacity on both and mostly remove them from the model itself, so the textures affect the background and atmosphere much more than the skin. Then I add this orange and blue overlay. Blur it heavily so only the colors stay visible, and the original texture underneath disappears, and switch it into subtract blend mode. And look at the effect this creates. Again, I lower the opacity and remove most of it from the model so it doesn't affect the skin tone too much. Now the lighting around the model feels much stronger. The edges of the frame get deeper and moodier, and these extra color tones from the overlay add a little more variation and atmosphere into the image while still keeping the main color harmony intact. And here I'm quickly adding the glow effect. I'm not gonna fully break this part down in this video because honestly, creating a glow effect alone could probably be its own long tutorial. So let me know in the comments if you'd actually want a separate deep dive where I show all the layer settings and explain how I build this effect properly. But for now, I'm just quickly painting on the mask where I want the glow to appear, adjusting the opacity and balancing the effects so it stays soft and atmospheric instead of becoming too overpowering. And finally, the last finishing touches. I want to add just a little more toning and color separation, so I'm using a few more built-in Photoshop loots that you can see on the screen right now. I'm mixing different blend modes and opacity levels, mostly to push the background slightly colder while making the model's wig even more saturated and red to strengthen the complementary color contrast across the whole image. So here I'm adding these three loots into one group, creating a mask and then painting the effect back only onto selected parts of the background and the wig. And just like with the overlays earlier, this isn't really about completely changing the image anymore. It's mostly about adding a little more tonal variation and making the final result feel richer and more visually interesting overall. And then the very final little finishing touch. I'm adding a bit of extra noise through a grain adjustment layer for stylization. And here is the before, and here is after. Honestly, I'm really happy with how this one turned out. It started as a pretty clean studio portrait, but now it feels like this whole dark cinematic Siren scene with an actual atmosphere and story behind it. And I think that's honestly my favorite part about compositing and color grading. Not even just changing how an image looks, but changing how it feels. Hopefully this video was interesting or helpful to watch, especially if you're into retouching, compositing, color grading, or just creative workflows in general. And if you want to see more breakdowns like this, definitely let me know in the comments because I read them all. Also, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future edits and videos. And yeah, thank you for hanging out and retouching with me for a little bit.